Recording in progress.
For as long as people have called this place home, they've been welcomed with clean air, clean water, and an abundance of nature. As time went on, people saw the need to balance how we build cities with how we protect farms and forests. That's why across Greater Portland, in 24 cities and 3 counties, there's one metro government that brings us all together to maintain that vital balance, to provide services across cities and counties, to create a better future together. Hello, we're Metro. We plan for housing, jobs, and safe transportation. We protect land, air, and water by managing garbage and recycling. We support arts and culture by overseeing local venues to keep the economy growing. And we connect people to nature across 17,000 acres of parks and trails and at the Oregon Zoo. Metro is all of us working together, connecting how we live today with how we plan for the future. Hello, we're Metro, and so are you.
All right, I declare a quorum, and the meeting is called to order. We are here on November 7th for the Metro Council work session, and I will ask our clerk, Connor, to call the roll.
Yes, thank you. Councillor Lewis.
Aye, right here.
Councillor Rosenthal. Here. Councillor Nolan.
Present.
Councillor Wong. Here. Councillor Gonzalez. Morning. Morning. Councillor Simpson.
Present from Oz.
And President Peterson.
Here, thank you. Before we begin our agenda items, can we please play the safety video for our in-person attendees?
I'm Bob Lee, one of the animal curators here at the Oregon Zoo, and safety is a huge part of our job. We focus on the safety of our guests who come to spend time with us every day, the staff who works very closely with these animals, and for the animals themselves. I'm here at the Oregon Zoo and you're in the Metro Regional Center. The council chambers are located on the 3rd floor. In the event of a fire or fire alarm, please exit through the door in the northeast corner of the room. Go down the stairs to the 2nd floor, exit through the main entrance by the reception desk, and gather in the courtyard outside that entrance. In the event of a medical or fire emergency, please call 911 and notify the security agent at the front desk. The nearest defibrillator is mounted on the steps leading from the reception desk down to Grand Avenue. Thank you, and come visit us at the zoo.
Great, thank you. Councilors, before we move on to our agenda items for today, I just wanted to let you know, and those tuning in, that we have made a change to our agenda on Thursday, November 9th. Resolution number 23-5366 in regards to performing a cost of service study of private transfer stations has been removed from the agenda. After our work session today, we will reassess where we're at and work on rescheduling that item. I also want to remind those who have signed up for Thursday to provide testimony that you are still able to do that at the beginning of our meeting on Thursday during public communication on non-agenda items, and can still submit comments in writing as well, and I encourage you all to do that. So that will move into our first item for today, discussion of impact recommendation and TPAC recommendation to JPAC on adoption of the 2023 RTP and 2023 high capacity transit strategy. We have with us today Catherine Charlo and Kim Ellis. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Council. Thank you, Council President Peterson, for having us here on our continuing tour of the RTP approval process between now and November 30th when it comes back to you. This will be your last chance as a council to discuss this topic until it comes before you on the 30th for a vote on the open ordinance, which Kim will remind you about in a few minutes. Before we get to that, just wanted to quickly frame up what we're going to do today, which is share with you a couple of recommendations that have come from your advisory committees. The MPAC recommendation comes directly to you from them. That was about a week and a half ago. Kim will walk through that. And then that served as the basis for a TPAC discussion last Friday. That won't come straight to you. It goes to JPAC, and JPAC then will make a recommendation that comes to you as their joint MPO recommendation. So that's the place we find ourselves today. Kim's going to briefly walk through them, and then we have time for discussion just to make sure you understand the recommendations and if you have any comments on them. So thanks so much.
Great. Next slide, please. For the record, Kim Ellis with Metro staff. And Catherine just covered these slides here, so I'll just move into the next slide, please. This is just a quick reminder of the timeline that we've been working under, working toward adoption of the 2023 Regional Transportation Plan before the current plan expires on December 6th. It's been a almost 2-year process since we began, and we've done a lot of work and accomplished a lot to get to this point. And so we are working to have JPAC and MPAC's recommendation coming to you on November 30th. Next slide. These are the 2 meetings. So JPAC's action is scheduled for next Thursday, a week from Thursday on November 16th. And then at that point, we will bring that forward along with the MPAC recommendation to you for your consideration. Next slide. This just is a reminder of all the work that you have done, our partners have done throughout the process to get to this point, and that we will continue to work together as a region and with these partners to begin implementing the plan as well. Next slide. So the recommendations that are coming before you as part of the Ordinance 23-1496 are coming to you in Exhibit C to that ordinance. That exhibit is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 are the policy topics, and that'll be what we focus on today, and hearing your discussion about that. The second part are what we have called consent items. That's more than 700 different individual comments that we responded to and made recommendations about, and that those would be approved without further discussion. And those both MPAC and TPAC have recommended approval of those consent items. It's really around the key policy topics in Exhibit C, Part 1, where there's more discussion recommended. Next slide. So the discussion items of those topics are around these 5 different areas. As we presented to you at your last work session, that there's a series of multiple recommendations within each of these topics that are recommended to revise the RTP or future work for us to complete between now and the next Regional Transportation Plan update. Next slide. The recommendations across those 5 topic areas are really aimed at better aligning the project list with the RTP goals. There's recommendations for changes in the current RTP, but also some process recommendations for the next update to the plan that we would implement. The second policy topic area is around the pricing policy implementation, and those recommendations are really aimed at making sure, ensuring that both the regional current concerns, but also local concerns that have been raised throughout the RTP process and the NEPA work that's underway for the ODOT toll projects are addressed as part of the NEPA work that's underway, but also as those projects move toward implementation. That is the topic area that really has more discussion that we will highlight a little bit more based on the MPAC and TPAC recommendation last Friday. The third topic area is around regional transportation funding, and those recommendations really are focused on future work for the region to work together to secure more funding for all of the transportation needs that we have across the region, including working with JPAC, but also working in advance of the legislative session in 2025, ensuring the region's competitive for federal funding and other activities. The fourth topic area is around the climate analysis and tools. Those recommendations are also aimed to help continue to work on improving our tools to inform policy and investment decisions that will impact climate. There are some recommended changes to this current RTP and the analysis that we've done, but also mapping out next steps for how we continue to develop those tools and use them to inform future decisions. And then the last topic area is around the mobility policy. As part of the RTP update, we worked in partnership with ODOT to update our 20-year-plus-old policy on mobility to broaden its focus from focusing solely on congestion to a more multimodal approach. We recognize that there's additional work to be done before it can be implemented at the local level and as part of an amendment to the Oregon Highway Plan. And so the recommendations for that topic area map out that final work that needs to be completed before it is included in the Regional Transportation Functional Plan and then subsequently implemented through local transportation system plans and when local governments make amendments to their comprehensive plan. So those are the highlights, and I just really want to also recognize your work in shaping these policy areas, the work that's been completed, as well as these recommendations. And the recommendations that were included in your packet reflect MPAC's recommendation to you. I'll highlight what TPAC did as part of this presentation. We didn't have that in time for the packet, but it really acknowledges your discussions and jurisdictional feedback that shaped all of these recommended changes to the plan and to future work that we do. Next slide. So leading up to the JPAC action on November 16th, as I noted, we will be walking through a series of actions, and this is essentially what TPAC did, MPAC did 2 weeks ago, and TPAC did last week, where the action is first to consider approval of those consent items as a bundle, and then walking through each of the 5 discussion items and requesting a recommendation for approval of those recommendations individually. And then an overall action on the Regional Transportation Plan Ordinance 23-1496, which pulls together the consent items as well as the individual actions on the policy topics as an overall recommendation on adoption of the Regional Transportation Plan. Also, at the November 16th meeting, JPAC will also be asked to make a recommendation to the Metro Council on adoption of the high-capacity transit strategy through a separate resolution, which I see dropped off the screen, and I don't recall the name of the number of the resolution right now, but it is a separate action and separate resolution that would happen after the final action on the Regional Transportation Plan. Next slide. So as Catherine noted, on Friday, TPAC did make a recommendation on the Regional Transportation Plan. Leading to that recommendation, we did ask TPAC to use the Metropolitan Policy Advisory Committee, or the MPAC recommendation, as a starting point. MPAC did recommend adoption of the RTP. And recommended a particular amendment that is highlighted here that I will highlight in terms of the TPAC discussion. Overall, TPAC made a very strong recommendation in support of adopting the Regional Transportation Plan to move forward to adoption. They approved, as MPAC did, the consent items as a bundle, and overwhelmingly, TPAC approved 4 out of the 5 discussion topics. The topic around the implementation of the pricing policy is the area where there was a very split vote on how to address the MPAC amendment that was adopted or recommended by MPAC on October 25th. As part of the MPAC action, they recommended as a body to phase, or basically split, the regional mobility policy project into two phases, retaining the preliminary engineering phase in the financially constrained project list, but shifting the implementation or construction phase to the strategic list. TPAC did not take an action on that amendment. What their action was to advance the impact recommendation to JPAC for further consideration as part of that split vote, and request that JPAC discuss and consider the impact recommendation to phase due to the complexity of the topic and also the political nature. There were a lot of concerns in that vote on that particular impact recommendation around the timing of this proposed amendment being at the end of the process. Also, there's a lot of questions around what the implications of this would be. And staff, we are able to answer some of those questions here today that the council may have. But TPAC also requested that Metro and ODOT staff provide as much information as possible about the implications of this recommended change as part of the JPAC discussion next week. Next slide. In particular, I wanted to highlight two parts of the TPAC recommendation that are revisions to what were included in your packet. Largely, MPAC retained a lot of the Metro staff recommendations that you viewed and discussed earlier in October. TPAC did as well, but there's one area that was struck and as part of the TPAC recommendation to JPAC is under recommended action 1A 2, basically removing language that would direct ODOT to present a revenue sharing approach to the OTC before January 1st, 2026. The other language that had been previously recommended was all retained and really is putting the work on developing a shared revenue sharing approach on the regional mobility project as Metro, JPAC, as well as working with ODOT and regional partners to come up with that, and expectation that as a follow-on to that process, that JPAC and the Metro Council would be testifying in support of that collaboratively developed approach. TPAC felt as part of their recommendation that it would be premature to have that directive statement at the end, and that was why that was recommended to be removed as part of their recommended action. Next slide. That disappeared. I'm not sure, Connor, but that wasn't.
Is that?
Yeah, so it's in there, but it's. That's interesting.
That's weird. Invisible ink.
Yeah. So the second area that I'll just keep going while they're trying to pull that up. Under the second recommendation, essentially under recommendation number 2 to policy topic 2 in your packet, TPAC recommended adding language that is asking JPAC to consider MPAC's recommendation. The language that they added was due to the technical complexity and political nature of the issue. JPAC should consider MPAC's recommendation to amend the regional transportation project list to split the regional mobility pricing project into 2 phases. TPAC members expressed concern with the process and precedent with the proposed amendment, and also recognized the volume of comments and concerns about the project and the process that is currently underway related to the RMPP, and to ensure that JPAC has the information from ODOT and Metro staff on the implications of phasing this, or as much information as possible as part of informing the JPAC action next week. So staff is preparing a memo to describe some of those implications, and again, we can answer some of those questions. Maybe go to the next slide. So ordinance 23-1496, I wanted to just highlight the pieces of that. The ordinance adopts the 2023 Regional Transportation Plan and appendices. Exhibit A is the public review draft, RTP. Exhibit B includes amendments to the regional framework plan. Those amendments ensure that the Regional Transportation Plan goals and objectives mirror what is in the regional framework plan exactly. So that is what that amendment does. And then Exhibit C, as I noted, those are the recommended actions in response to the public comments that we received, as well as the recommendations that were brought forward to you in Part 1 and Part 2 of Exhibit C. And then Exhibit D will be our findings of compliance with the statewide planning goals. And just to reiterate, the Regional Transportation Plan is a federal document, but it is also a regional transportation system plan under state law, and this constitutes a land use action. That is why it's adopted by ordinance, and why we also adopt findings of compliance with the statewide planning goals as part of that action. Next slide. So today, this is an opportunity for council to ask questions and also respond around whether the recommendations as were in your packet, and that I've highlighted the key changes that TPAC recommended in their recommendation to JPAC, do they adequately advance council priorities and desired outcomes for this RTP and as we go forward? And then are there things that are of concern or that you would like to see additions or changes as part of this coming forward to JPAC for consideration next week? JPAC will be considering TPAC's recommendation, but also the recommendation to discuss MPAC's recommendation on phasing the regional mobility pricing project.
Thank you, Kim. And I really appreciate your walking us through that. And one thing I wanted to highlight before you all ask questions or begin your discussion is implicit in what Kim just described, but I just want to make sure I call it out, which is in the conversations that we've had with you in these meetings since September, you have offered a number of suggestions, requests, comments, policies, and those have made their way into what was the staff recommendation, which went first to TPAC, to MTAC, then to MPAC. And because I think it can get lost in this, I want to emphasize that those have stayed intact all the way through that process. And in fact, they've gathered strength and support in most arenas going along the way. So thank you for those, and know that your fingerprints are fully on this document and in this document as we move forward as well.
Great, thank you. I think that's good clarification as well. Appreciate that. Councilors, any comments? Since this is the last time we will see it before it comes back to us from JPAC. Councilor Gonzalez?
Thank you. Any chance you could put the questions back up on the screen so I make sure I don't just talk and not answer the questions? Thank you. All right, well, while we get to those, I just want to acknowledge how significant the engagement and collaboration has been with regional partners on this RTP. And there are multiple policy items in this process and in the RTP that, as we move forward towards a JPAC vote next week and a council vote in a few weeks, I think that there's a lot for our region and our constituents to be proud of. I don't feel the need to necessarily list all those things right now. And I also know as we work through some of the amendments and conversation through RMPP, I think that conversation and the actions reflect where our region is in embracing a very complicated policy issue that helps us achieve a lot of goals and also help pay for things. So I just want to reiterate that as JPAC and our JPAC counselors, we're working very closely on on all the steps that we need to take to make sure that, one, the region's voice is heard, and that also that Metro's goals and the goals of this council are reflected in time for our vote as well. So just those are some really high-level things that that I wanted to share. In terms of the last question for other additions or changes, recommendations, I can't think of anything right now that I haven't already shared in the extensive conversations that we've had. But again, I think what we want to communicate to JPAC and to the region is that we are going to approve this RTP, and there's a lot of good in this RTP. That's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Other counselors on JPAC? Oh, we've got hands up, sorry. Counselor Rosenthal, and then coming back around. Go ahead, Counselor.
Are you calling on me? I couldn't quite hear you.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair Peterson. First of all, I want to say that I appreciate the great amount of work that's gone in. A lot of this work will probably never be quite appreciated, but the process has been laborious, and I understand that, and also complicated. I have some general comments, but I'll save those maybe for later or maybe for the last meeting. But I do have a question. From the federal standpoint, one of the main reasons why we have to approve this course is so that we can keep federal funding flowing for the constrained list of projects. From the federal standpoint, do they care whether or not we approve an RTP with a two-phase congestion pricing or pricing policy or a single-phase pricing policy? It would seem to me that it doesn't matter too much in terms of the flowing of the funds, at least not during the first year or two, which one we approve. I understand it's politically sensitive. It's sensitive in all of our jurisdictions, but does the federal institutions care about that?
That's a great question, Councilor Rosenthal. So what the feds care about in terms of that project, it's important for the preliminary engineering phase to be in the financially constrained system so that that project can continue to move forward in the planning work, receive the money that ODOT and the OTC will be programming to it in the statewide transportation improvement program. So the key thing is that the preliminary engineering phase be retained in the
Right.
in the financially constrained list. In order for federal approvals to be received after the NEPA process is completed, the construction phase must be in the financially constrained project list at that time.
Okay, thanks.
Counselor Wong.
Great, thank you, Madam President, and thank you for all the staff for incorporating all the feedback from all our partners as well as this council. Pretty happy with where this has ended up. I do have a question on kind of the focus on safety, and I'm wondering if you could speak more in kind of on the ground terms how we're going to improve safety across the region, and then I'm especially curious about the kind of ODOT pot of safety dollars, and has there been any movement on, being a little more specific on how that might be applied? Just because I'm really feeling kind of all the, traffic fatalities and violence we've experienced over the last couple of years.
Yes, thank you, Councilor Wong. So yes, part of the recommendations that are coming before you and that ODOT supports is unbundling about $65 million worth of projects from that safety bucket that you've heard testimony about. And so we've identified that. That's included as an attachment to that set of recommendations. We've also and that will allow us to, as we update and do a final evaluation of the overall RTP performance after the RTP is adopted, we will include those projects in that analysis. And so we'll have some new findings around how we're doing investing in safety as part of the RTP. In addition, other recommendations are that we have more regular reporting around how the region is investing in safety and what the outcomes of those investments are. There's also work currently underway. Lake Strongheart McTighe is leading the Safe Streets for All grant, which is a safety focus. That is going to be happening over the next year and a half, I believe. And that is really going to be identifying identifying what kinds of investments are improving safety, what are the outcomes, doing case studies, and really looking at it from a design perspective and other factors that are affecting safety on our transportation system. So there are a series of many different recommendations that are part of the packet for this RTP, but then post RTP adoption.
Thanks. And can you clarify what unbundling?
Yes, so ODOT had a project in the project list that was, now I don't have it off the top of my head what the total amount was, but essentially it was a bucket of funding that was a placeholder for potential safety investments, but it did not specify what kind of investments they would be, where they would be located. And so what we have done, worked with them to identify projects that they have already identified that would be implemented on their parts of the transportation system that were filling gaps in sidewalks, ADA accessibility, improving access to transit. And those are specific projects that we'll be able to account for. They'll be added to the project list instead of being part of that larger bundle. And then I would say that as part of the next RTP update, that we would continue to work with them to have even more than what we were able to do for this update.
And maybe I could add just one more thing, Counselor. Thank you for the question, because it really reflects something we heard all the way through the comment period from every single partner, jurisdiction, and the public. And just taking a little bit of a dive into transportation wonkiness, that mobility policy is actually a big deal in this context because it moves us toward considerations including safety and system completeness, which is such a key element of safety, instead of just looking at congestion and capacity. So as we've talked about throughout this process, trying to get a better match over the course of developing the next RTP between some of these values and the projects, that's going to be an important tool for doing that.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Councilor Lewis and then Councilor Gonzalez.
Sure, thank you. I feel like the opportunity to hear from MPAC and their expertise coming from a wider kind of perspective, looking at it the land use planning perspective, and not just about service delivery. Not to say that JPAC only looks at service delivery, but from being a table that spends a lot of time talking about planning and planning to plan, I'm actually very impressed by the recommendations, and I think they are the right ones to bring to JPAC. So I'm happy with TPAC's refinements, particularly the understanding of the phasing being more a political question than a technical question, since it is possible and there is that kind of right line moment when you flip from planning and putting concepts on a table to actually starting to implement and purchase things to make it so. So I look forward to this conversation at the JPAC table. I think we can be really proud, not only of the policies, but also of the work that's gone into making the project list as best as possible. So thank you to the staff, and I guess I'm just wanting to spend time to thank MPAC and TPAC for wrestling with us.
Great, thank you. Councilor Gonzalez.
Yeah, thanks, President Peterson. There's just a few other things that have come to mind as there's so many moving pieces with this, but you know, very similar to what Councilor Lewis mentioned regarding the phasing aspect of it. I think one of the items that we'll need to keep a close eye on as Metro and as a council is understanding how our goals around climate and system completeness evolve as this policy changes is recommended and move forward. And also, I want to make sure that oops, it's okay.
Sorry. It won't turn off.
It's okay. I want to make sure okay, great. Yeah, where was I? That at the JPAC table, another thing that we're going to be kicking off in 2024 as well is a look at revenue and just a conversation. I think there's a long-standing conversation that needs to happen around there. and how as a region we can step up and communicate our needs and participate in the leadership that's happening, north of us as well in Washington State and building the system we want to make. There's a lot of questions right now around how we're able to prioritize resources that don't go as far. And I think we're seeing that pop up in some of the amendments and changes that we've seen from MPAC and TPAC and all the different committees that advise us, but also in different committees that I sit on, and I'm sure that others sit on as well. A really big conversation that I'm looking forward to dive into a little bit more deeply, and I know as a staff we are as well. And not trying to get ahead of ourselves, but it's an item I think too that is bubbling through this RTP process and looking at the 2028 RTP. And I know that this council has also really expressed the desire to start the planning with a lot of with vigor and with commitment to achieving our goals for 2028 as well. So I just wanted to highlight that as well and make sure that's not lost in the in this kind of runway that we're in.
Great, thank you. Councilor Simpson and then Nolan.
Thank you, Council President. I want to express my gratitude to staff. I know it's been a long, arduous process, but we're getting there. I know that, to respond to 7, no easy feat. I will say this, there's one committee that I'm going to bring up that, it doesn't have a role in this, but they are really supportive of this, and that's in MUCTUC, East Multnomah County Transportation Committee. It's represented by a number of the cities in East County, and there's strong support for this RTP, even now, because some of the recommendations, because some of the serving members on that body serve on MPAC and JPAC, include myself and Mayor Stovall. And we feel heard in East County. We feel like we are, the things that we are bringing forward, especially in this climate where, there was just another fatality right at 82nd and Burnside this morning. And I know a few days ago, there was another right at Division and I believe it was 122nd. And so, as we continue to fight and face these issues around traffic deaths and violence, it's really good to hear and see that the things that we bring up and highlight in our communities are being put to the forefront. So I just wanted to extend my appreciation to you all. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Madam President. Thanks for the presentation. I appreciate the evolution of this draft RTP since it was first discussed here in specifics over the summer. It has improved. The richness of all the input that has come from advisory committees and local electeds is noted, is reflected in what we have before us. What continues to trouble me about it, though, is an absence of a feedback loop and a capacity or a mandate even to respond when our predicted outcomes don't materialize. MPAC reflected that in asking to remove language about safety because of their concerns that highway projects would impact local surface street safety in ways that weren't accounted for. I continue to think that we are relying much too heavily on external uncertain actions at the state and federal level for our climate goals. Especially concerned because we did that in past efforts and the evidence is very clear that we can't rely on those actions from others because the outcome in fact took us in the wrong direction on climate leadership and reduction of greenhouse gases. So the concern I continue to have is where we instill or infuse into this process a feedback loop that says, okay, we think this project will improve safety, will help reduce greenhouse gases, will improve economic prosperity. And then if it doesn't, what happens? And in particular, obviously we won't tear up the concrete, but will we use that information of unsatisfied objectives to inform what we do about similar projects based on similar assumptions that one could extend to say, since we've seen that those assumptions don't actually play out on the ground, what do we do about other projects that are built on them? Proposed projects or restricted funding projects. That remains a big issue for me about this, and I don't have a sentence we could insert to ameliorate that. But I just wanted to lay that out, and if staff has suggestions on how we might accomplish that, I would love to hear them.
Counselor, thank you for the question. I'm not going to give you a completely satisfactory answer, I fear, but the answer that I will give is, I think, an answer that shows progress over time, which is, as we look at the project selection process for the next RTP, we are thinking hard about how to take the policy statements and commitments from this council and from the region and translate them into a stronger set of sort of requirements for those projects. The intention and I think the ability is there, even more so now because of the mobility policy and because of some of the transparency that we've built in as a result of your recommendations. The document, the RTP, remains simply a regional menu. It's not Metro's transportation vision writ large. It is our region's vision, and our region has different opinions. And so I think the conversation will continue to be very real around what you're talking about, and we'll continue to need to have policy tools like the mobility policy and good analytics, which you have pressed us on, and we'll need to bring those to the table and have these conversations around the region. So it's not a perfect answer, but I appreciate the question.
And I appreciate your acknowledging the gap between what we have, born of all of this input process. And for me, since we're in a transportation mode, the key question that I am not yet settled on is, if we compare it to braking before the road goes off the cliff, slowing our vehicle down is a step in the right direction, but the pace at which we slow is critical. And I'm just not persuaded we have enough on the brakes to keep us from going over the cliff.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for all of the work that has gone. This has been a multi-year. I think the first set of conversations that we had when Councilor Gonzalez and Councilor Lewis and I were all brand new 5 years ago was the mobility research. And then it became a proposal, and then it got into this document we're looking at. And that has been a major movement forward. So thank you for that. I can't overstate how important that is to the future of being able to articulate the criteria so that we are actually using the criteria and its weight appropriately as we move forward. So again, thank you. I think the conversation around a regional RTP is so interesting because I just got back from testifying in front of, weirdly enough, the Minnesota legislature, where they were thinking about how to think about governance structure of their Met Council, which is essentially our sister agency, very similar role, but a governor appointed instead of being duly elected. It became very clear to me, and I told them at the very end that I think the difference in cultures between what we've set up here in Oregon and what they have in Minneapolis, it was very top-down decision-making, and what we have is very bottoms-up. It was a ballot measure created home rule charter, and that bottoms-up means that we work together with our partners to come up with this vision, and I think that we're definitely moving in the right direction as a region, and this is a significant step. I think where we need to go next, and we've articulated that in the next steps, is we have a 2040 to 2070 update that we need to talk about. We have a strategic target goal setting that we're doing for a 5, maybe 10-year time period, and how do we balance between the two of those to get the outcomes that we all want, short-term and long-term. And I think that's where this council is really wanting to take the next conversation. And when you overlay that with the conversation we've been having on the housing side, this gets incredibly serious, because the entire problem with accelerating housing is that we do not have infrastructure to be able to do that. And here we sit saying, we need the right types of projects. We know what types of projects we need in this region to actually accelerate housing and to accelerate GHG emissions. Getting that criteria in place, having that conversation is going to be really important, because we cannot accelerate housing if we do not have the foundation to build it on, and we do not. And so the 1,000 Friends, and we were a sponsor. I can't remember the other partners that were sponsored, just released the video from this week, talking about how California has worked at the statewide level to identify the fact that they did not have a good partnership with their cities, and how do they get the infrastructure out there, and how do they partner. I think everybody here should be looking at that video. I'm going to tout it. It was the most informative thing, and I was even listening. I would listen to it all morning. And there were a lot of good takeaways in there for our state partners on how to work together, and how do we relate to them, and how do we keep pushing. This is, I think, our number one thing, is to push that we need a better state partnership and a better federal partnership in order to accelerate our way out of this housing crisis. I think this is why we have the strategic plan, is because we're all feeling the anxiety, both in the emergency on the housing and the emergency on the climate change and on jobs. So I think we're headed in the right direction, and I'm really appreciative of that. Now, I just want to round my comments out on the conversation with the RMPP and tolling, and I think what I'm seeing coming out of TPAC is encouraging. And I think it actually allows for us to have the conversation that has been requested at the local level, and really asserts the locals. And again, that's why I'm going back to this conversation in Minneapolis, is that this region really identifies with bottoms up. And our local jurisdictions have been underwater, not getting the answers that they need in order to be able to move forward on not just transportation projects, but being able to get their housing production going. I think this is what people aren't seeing, is that everything at the state level, if you slow and you don't listen to the jurisdictions who are actually implementing this on the ground and having to move people within this region, the minute you knock them out of the conversation, then you're slowing down the economic vitality of this entire region. And so I think being able to articulate that through the TPAC proposal and whatever then gets discussed at JPAC, I think it's the right direction, and I'm happy that they're having that conversation. And I look forward to how we work with them to help articulate all of the issues, but I don't see this as an issue. I lived through a defunding of a project. This is not a defunding of a project. This is a phasing of a project, right? The Washington State Legislature defunded the Columbia River crossing. That's a defunding. The project was dead for 10 years. In this case, what I'm seeing is an interest in the local jurisdictions and having a full conversation and just asking to slow it down until their answers are there. And that there's a full opportunity to negotiate how we move forward in this arena. So I'm very pleased that the local jurisdictions have proposed this, and maybe there needs to be some more articulation of what criteria and what questions they want answered in it, and not just this phasing approach, because I think we need to be as clear as we possibly can coming out of the region with our partner to say, but this is really what we've been asking for, and this is what we need to see. So I'm excited to see what comes out of the next conversation and comes back up to us. With that, any other further conversations on the RTP? Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I would be remiss if I didn't sort of summarize a couple comments or the comments that I hear from some of our local jurisdictions in three particular aspects regarding the RTP. I mean, it's going to go forward, and I appreciate the comments that that TPAC and that MPAC have made, and look forward to what JPAC is going to do. They're going to have some interesting discussions. But the points that I hear are, one is that a list of projects, however good and however wonderful, does not constitute a regional vision, because none of the individual components or none of the individual players really is responsible for, other than perhaps Metro, coming up with a regional vision. Their additional concern is that they don't feel that ODOT has a regional perspective, particularly on pricing and tolling, that really encompasses all the regional implications that might have, that they're focusing primarily on project and funding. And the third one is that the growth concept, as we know, needs to be refreshed. We're moving in directions that are not entirely anticipated, and that their concern is that the RTP does not entirely recognize the fact that this is something that has to be updated and responded to. Thank you.
All right. With that, seeing no other hands raised, thank you again to the tens of hundreds of staff around the region that have weighed in and worked on getting us to this point, as well as our own. So thank you, much appreciated. And again, Kim, what number iteration of RTP updates has this been for you?
I think it's 5.
5? Thank you. Much appreciated. All right. With that, we'll move on to our next agenda item, and good job, everyone. All right, so I will call up. We got a lot of people hanging out in the back, not coming forward. We've got Marta McGuire, Holly sorry, I'm going to get your last name wrong. I've never. Sterncorp.
I think we had the high-capacity transit discussion after this.
Oh, I thought that we had covered it all in that conversation.
I think Ally was prepared.
Oh, sorry, guys.
Ally was prepared to do a brief presentation and answer any questions.
We have people here to testify on the next item. Maybe we could switch the order.
How long will it take? And there's no testimony today. This is a work session.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think that you all have heard information about the high-capacity transit strategy before. Ally could probably give a pretty brief summary of the ordinance and what the recommendation from MPAC and JPAC was. MPAC and TPAC. And at least then you all know that. And I think we could do that in about 15 minutes. Ally, does that sound about right?
Yes, the presentation that I have is only about 7 or 8 minutes long, and I could squish it to even 5.
Ally, squish. I like squish. Okay, let's move into that. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead and next slide, please. So thank you so much. I'm here just to provide a couple brief updates on where the high capacity transit strategy is now based on when I last came and presented in May. So at that time, we were getting ready to release the public review draft strategy. Next slide, please. This is something that you heard about from Kim over the summer, so I won't, for sake of time, go back over that. But basically, we took the feedback that we heard in meetings with council, meeting with the advisory committees, from community and the county coordinating committees, and incorporated that into that document that was released in May. Next slide, please. And these are a few of the types of changes that we made to that report. Next slide, please. A few others, and this will also be in your packet described in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. And then so that brought us to the public review draft strategy. Next slide, please. And on that, we received 56 comments, so less than the RTP as a whole. And those comments expressed a lot of support for the vision that we had identified in the strategy and the tier 1 and 2 corridor priorities, as well as some considerations about challenges, opportunities, and trade-offs. And I mention that just because those informed the responses and recommended changes that will be, we have proposed to create the adopted strategy. Next slide, please. And I won't, again, for sake of time, go into the details, but there is more information about these in the packet. Next slide, please. And these are just the high level summary of what those changes were. And these are really in response to what we heard from committees and staff, again, as well as community through those comments that we received. Next slide, please. And so that brings us to today, where we are previewing adoption in preparation for that decision on the 30th. Next slide, please. And so just going over the items that will be considered on the 30th that are part of your packet. The resolution language is in attachment 1. In Exhibit A, attachment 2, that was the high capacity transit strategy document that was provided for public review this summer, which is why I mentioned some of the changes that we made to that based on feedback. And then in Exhibit B, attachment 3 is the summary of the comments received and the staff recommended changes based on the public review period. And that I went through really quickly, highlighted in summary and earlier in the presentation. And then attachment 4 is the staff report to the resolution that will come back to you on the 30th, along with JPACT and MPACT's recommendations. Next slide, please. And then, so just where we are so far, on October 18th, MTAC recommended that MPAC vote to recommend approval of Resolution 23-5348 by Metro Council, and MPAC took that recommendation and does recommend Council approve the resolution. TPAC similarly recommended that JPAC recommend approval of the resolution at their meeting on November 3rd. And the next step is that JPAC will consider their recommendation to you at the November 16th meeting before I come back to you on the 30th. Next slide, please. And I will skip some of the next steps because I can talk more about this on the 30th at the next presentation. So next slide, please. And I will end there. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Allie. Councilors, any questions on the high capacity transit resolution? Ordinance. It was an ordinance. Nope.
It's a resolution.
Just thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Solid policy. Thanks, Allie.
All right, thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll
Thanks,
move on
Ally.
now. Thank you. All right, now we'll move on to the rate transparency. Thank you, everybody, for getting up twice. That was my, helpful get your steps in. So councilors, as you recall, we had a discussion on October 26th meeting about rate transparency. At that meeting, we received a presentation from staff on the progress of this work, and we're asked to give guidance on proceeding with a cost of service study for rates at private transfer stations. At that meeting, but really since we started the conversation last year during budget and fee development, we as a council have received input and public testimony from many stakeholders. This has included concerns about the current lack of rate transparency and the cost of services raised by our cities and counties, and concerns from the private transfer stations around possible study design issues and data security. We had a lot to discuss at that meeting and have invited staff back to help us further discuss the issue at hand. And as you recall, I pulled this from the agenda for Thursday so that we can have a little bit more time in between whatever goes to the council to make sure that everybody's issues and concerns are baked into whatever comes before us at that time. So with that, I will turn it over to Marta.
Great, thank you. Good morning,
you.
President Peterson and councilors. Again, my name is Marta McGuire, Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Director, and I have here with me Jenna Jones, our State and Regional Affairs Advisor, and Holly Stornkirk, Principal Planner. We appreciate the opportunity to engage with you again today on this topic. And as noted, this conversation is a continuation of council's discussion on the 26th on our work to date on rate transparency and a request for guidance on proceeding with formal consideration of a resolution to direct staff to conduct a cost of service study on the rates of private transfer stations. We have a short presentation here for you today to recap our discussion from last month, provide responses to questions that have come up in the interim, as well as stakeholder feedback. So with that, I will turn it over to Jenna.
Awesome. Thank you, counselors. For those who don't know me and who are watching virtually, I'm Jenna Jones. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the State and Regional Affairs Advisor. It's a fancy name for lobbyist, and I work in our Government Affairs Department. Thank you for laughing at my jokes. It keeps me going during these presentations. I'm going to do the easy part where I will do the high-level overview of what we went over last time, which had lively discussion, and then I will let Holly answer all of the highly technical questions because she is the subject matter expert. But I also just want to recognize that this has been a very big hot topic, and we've had many stakeholders take time out of their days to come and watch both the previous council meeting and this council meeting, and so we very much appreciate those folks giving input, and hopefully we can cover some of that within our presentation. So we'll start off with what our current policy framework is right now when it relates to this project of rate transparency at private transfer stations. So we have the 2030 Regional Waste Plan. I think you guys have heard a lot about that in your presentations from WPEZ over the years and a lot in the last month. Goal 14 specifically is to advance the adoption of rates that are reasonably responsive to user economic needs, regionally consistent, and well understood. Right now we have a problem with that last part. They're well understood, so we can't answer the other questions. Are they reasonable? Are they responsive to user economic needs? But the goal is to get to a place where we can check all of those and say yes. The next thing that happened was in 2016. There was a transfer system configuration policy. There are two main things about this. It was a pathway to ensure rate transparency, and this is a step within that policy that was passed by that council at the time. But it also started the first part of our tonnage allocation, and Holly will get into all of the specifics of tonnage allocation later because, again, that is technical and I would mess it up. So next slide, please. Here's the kind of timeline of that rate transparency process or project and where we've been and where we want to go. And also this is kind of the timeline of the transfer system configuration policy that I talked about on the last slide. So one of the things that kind of stood up the need for this rate transparency project was our local government partners began expressing concerns in 2010 as rates at private facilities began to exceed the rates at Metro's public transfer stations. So we came up with a 3-step policy. Step 1 was to estimate the costs at our public stations because we own them, and so that is easier for us to estimate. Publish these costs and provide a clear benchmark for local governments in their rate setting process. We finished step 1 in 2017. Then we moved to step 2, which was we conducted a high-level cost study of private wet waste transfer station costs to estimate various components, transfer, transport, disposal of each station's tip fee. This was just a model study, so it didn't have any specifics. A lot of it was used on public information that was available to folks and some interviews. So we completed step 2 in 2019. Also in 2019, we came back to council at that time, and local governments asked council for the first time to move to step 3 because step 2 was not good enough. Step 3 is conducting a full detailed cost of service study at private waste transfer stations, including a detailed review of financial records to determine costs of relative to rates charged. And because I've said this in passing a couple times, I'm gonna back up a little bit and say we're only talking about wet waste. Holly will continue to go into that later, but wet waste is your typical garbage. That's what you should think of. Don't think of your dry waste, which is typically your recycling. So just garbage. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the impacts of these rates and some of the concerns that our local government partners have had over the years, and what that does to different stakeholder groups within the region. So I'll start by saying in 2022, rates ranged from slightly below Metro's rate to 15% above Metro's rate. And then in 2023, rates were equal to Metro's rate, or 6% above. And why this is important is we started a voluntary incentive program called the Goal-Based Tonnage Allocation Program. And though we've heard from many stakeholders that the public transfer stations and private transfer stations are not apples to apples, we understand the costs of the public transfer stations. And also we provide certain services that most of the private transfer stations do not. Self-haul, we have longer hours, things of those like. And so in the early stages of the transfer station configuration policy, we thought, oh, they should be able to meet our rate. However, we don't have that data to kind of back up if they can or cannot meet our rate. So that is why it's important of whether or not they meet Metro's rate and the range of rates. So the impacts of rate inequities span different folks, and we have our local government partners who set rates. And for hauling services, they do rate reviews. They have to use something for garbage disposal, and they look to us for that. And so when they don't have that, their haulers have no choice but to use whatever's closest most likely, and that can raise the garbage fees for their ratepayers. And then in some places, we have haulers that have multiple options for wet waste transfer, and the local government may use a composite rate for transfer or just use Metro's fees. So I want to share a couple of comments that we had from our stakeholders at our last meeting. A lot of folks in our local government sector sent different emails to you counselors and letters. And so I'll stop here and read a couple of things. Here's a quote from the letter that Hillsborough Mayor Steve Calloway wrote to council. In Washington County, community members have seen private transfer station rates exceed Metro's rates since 2011. Initially, the difference between these rates were modest, less than $1 per ton, but over time, a significant difference in rates developed, as much as $26.95 per ton, or 18.7% higher, depending on load size. That's one city. Then the city of Cornelius also shared what it means for their rates. And so the cost for curbside collection of garbage and recycling service is unjustified, with most of the material collected in Cornelius going to the private facility in Forest Grove. We have seen the cost for the curbside service increase dramatically over past several years, with a growing portion of that cost, now 27%, and by far the largest, being disposal. This is an entirely unjustified burden placed on our community members. So that's just a couple of snippets from around the region. And we'll move over to the residential ratepayers and the business. It's all tied to what the local governments do and how they set rates themselves on hauling services. That can be trickled down over to the ratepayer. I want to make a clear point that the transfer stations currently who do not meet Metro's rate span across the region. So this is not, while I just read things from folks in Washington County, this is not a Washington County only problem. It impacts folks in Gresham, Troutdale, and Wilsonville, and Forest Grove. So if you cut our region into a triangle, it would touch all portions, each corner of the region. So this is an impact, and a lot of those transfer stations have impacts on our communities with the highest percentage of people with low incomes. So it's adding another disparate impact. I'll read another portion of the City of Cornelius's letter about residential ratepayers, but also small businesses who need to drop things off to a transfer station. Here in Cornelius, customers have little choice. Since the public facilities are either in North Portland or Oregon City, parts of our community are also among the poorest in the region. The nearest transfer station in Forest Grove charges a minimum of $70 for a car or a small truck, just under $100 for a pickup load. Comparatively, Metro charges a minimum fee of $35. The minimum at our local transfer station is double that of the public facilities, with no justification. So that's what we've been hearing from some of our stakeholders, that the dropping off as an individual going to just a transfer station or a small business going to a transfer station kind of shows how the garbage rates flow to our business partners as well and have impacts there. Next slide. Okay, so I talked about step 2. We had a model once upon a time. Why didn't that work? Why can't we use that? Why can't we revamp that? There are limitations to a model study. During the last council meeting, we talked a lot about the report that was published on step 2. You have since all received that via email. You can read more in depth. It's a long, lengthy report, but I'll summarize. The cost of service study had limitations because the estimates were based on unchecked assumptions and publicly available information, so we didn't actually get actuals to compare to our estimated values. And then there are just differences among our transfer stations that are meaningful differences. Some of our transfer stations are vertically integrated, some are partially integrated companies. For those who are like, what did you just say to me? That means some of them are national companies or statewide and have multiple different segments of their company, not just here in the region, and others that are far more local. And that has been one of the things that the transfer station configuration policy looked at, just recognizing the difference between the private sector and also before that, the transfer station ownership policy and looking at our public-private system. There are different types of privates, just like public and private don't always look alike as well. And so we actually need hard cost data and not estimates if we want to see what those meaningful differences are and make decisions that are responsive to those meaningful differences. So we did an estimate. It wouldn't matter who did a model or a study or estimates. They would all probably have these issues because we're not actually fact checking them with the data. Next slide. So the staff recommendation we gave you last time was moving to step 3, which I will just breeze over very quickly. It would be convening a committee comprised of industry, community, and local government partners. The thought behind this, and Holly will go way more in depth in this later, is to have all 6 private transfer stations at the table. And then we would hire a third-party contractor to help structure the cost of service study and look at what the kind of study design is and what we should look at. And then we would conduct that independent cost of studies of all private transfer stations, determine the costs relative to the rates charged, and then provide those findings back to Metro Council for consideration on your decision-making on other projects that that need this data. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about stakeholder feedback. I've been weaving it in and out, but I wanted to also say some of the steps that staff have gone through before we've gotten to this point. On October 19th, staff were before the Regional Waste Advisory Committee, and really it was just Holly because she's great. And community members and local government members were very supportive of Metro Council moving forward with step 3. As I said, we've had a lot of folks being engaged and showing up in person. We had local governments attending the last meeting in support, and we also had industry representatives who testified both at RWAC, the Regional Waste Advisory Committee, and before you last time, expressing some concerns. particularly around how Metro is going to deal with comparing public to private, our apples to oranges problem, and being transparent about the rates that we're charging. And then also around confidentiality. How do you keep all of this information confidential? I have hope that we can do it, and Holly will talk about that later. And so that was one of the things, those are a couple of the things we've been hearing. I will also move your attention to our RWAC member. One of the RWAC members said, we are focusing right now on the regionally consistent and well understood, and so this study is meant to bring some light to things to be well understood. I think I started by saying we're on the well understood part, and that is directly from the RWAC member who said this, because it made the most sense. We really don't understand all of the rates in the system, and so that has to be the baseline before we can make any decisions. I want to touch on one more letter from one of our local government partners, and that's from the city of Portland. They had a very particular thought that I think bears saying to council. Private transfer stations are right to point out that they bear different costs and may not have the same returns to scale as Metro transfer stations. We're apples to oranges, we're not the same. A cost of service study could help clarify those trade-offs. Capping private transfer station fees at Metro would provide predictability, but would not reveal whether those fees are reasonable, particularly since Metro fees have increased significantly, and transfer stations offer different services. This situation also can't be remedied easily by increased competition. Transfer stations are expensive, hard to cite, and some are isolated geographically. So I think all of those things ring true when we're thinking about our system, and those are all things that Holly will touch on next. So next slide. And I'll turn it over to Holly.
Good morning still, Holly Sternkorb. I'm with the Policy and Program Development team. Thanks again for your time. Looking forward to getting into more detail. What I'm going to go into is a little bit more detail on what some of your questions are, and then more detail on what the study is going to look like. And also what some of the other local governments do as a comparable exercise during their rate reviews, annual rate reviews. First of all, as you know, Metro's primary responsibility is regional planning and policy making, including the operation of our solid waste disposal system. Metro also has explicit authority to set rates. And we could set rates for the privately owned transfer stations. Next slide, please. There is concern that this project would lead to a discussion of rate regulation of the private transfer stations. Metro does not regulate rates right now, and we have not done so in the past. Metro currently, as Jenna touched on, Metro currently provides oversight of rates by providing a voluntary incentive through the goals-based tonnage allocation program. Next slide, please. While baseline cost information can inform rate regulation, that's not the intent of the project. We are asking for a cost of service study to better inform policy decisions for wet waste transfer. We're not asking Metro Council to regulate rates. A cost of service study, as you know, is a detailed accounting and summary of all costs associated with a service or a system. And it provides the actual baseline costs needed for planning. We understand the cost of service for our public stations, but we do not understand the cost for the private stations. So this information would allow us to see a full picture of the wet waste transfer system in the region. You've heard how this will support our local government partners, and you've heard some of the direct quotes from their letters. An example of how this information would inform planning, our regional planning, and to help address concerns of our industry partners, just a couple of examples of that are the tonnage allocation program, which we've just talked about, as well as our benchmark rate. Private transfer stations have said that the tonnage allocation program impacts their revenues, and matching Metro's fee as a benchmark rate affects their rate of return. Understanding the cost of service for private wet waste transfer would allow for an assessment of the revenue needs of the private transfer stations, and then once we understand those revenue needs, it would allow us to understand how many tons are needed to cover costs and to operate efficiently, or what base rate per ton is needed to cover costs. This understanding could inform changes to the tonnage allocation program or to adjustments to our benchmark rate. We can't make those changes unless we have that information to do planning. The baseline cost information would also inform decision-making for the system's facilities plan. Scenarios could include requiring private transfer stations to provide self-haul services to better serve communities across the region. To evaluate the cost impacts to private customers and to the transfer stations themselves, we need to understand those current costs. And this will help inform Metro Council's decisions on if the rates need to increase or if the services can be provided under the rates that are charged. And another scenario I know that's out there is full privatization of wet waste transfer. And so in order to make a good decision there, we need to understand the current costs. Go ahead and next slide. Metros, this is a map of the current transfer system. As you know, our system includes private transfer as well as publicly owned transfer stations.
And if anyone needs it, we have a printout. It might be a little bit clearer to read.
The publicly owned stations are indicated in red and the private are indicated in blue. And you can see the geographic distribution of the services. While all these transfer stations offer wet waste transfer, the other services are different. And the ownership models are different as well. With that said, each station is important to the region. Metro stations offer important public services that the privates don't. And while the location of each of the private transfer stations, their locations offer the needed geographic distribution of services throughout the region to provide efficient transportation and keep those transportation costs down. It's expensive to move garbage. To add complexity, as Jenna said, there are also different ownership models among the private stations. Some are partially integrated, which means they've got two service lines, which is collection and transfer, and others are fully integrated, which means they've got collection, transfer, and disposal. This impacts the playing field for private transfer stations because partially integrated firms have fewer lines of business to pull returns from in order to invest in improvements compared to the fully integrated firms. Next slide, please. Private transfer stations have expressed concern that Metro is a competitor in this system and should not conduct a cost of service study because it would be a conflict of interest. First of all, I want to say again that Metro is responsible for operation of the solid waste system. The agency has allowed the private transfer stations to provide service because of the value they add due to location. But to effectively manage the entire system and provide the best value for the ratepayers, Metro needs to understand the cost of the system, including those services provided by the public sector. Second, there's little competition in the provision of transfer services regardless of if it's provided by public or private. This occurs for a number of reasons. First, it's only economic to deliver waste to a facility that's close to the collection route. You can think of this as like a natural geographic monopoly. Second, collection firms that are vertically integrated gain an additional margin of profit by delivering waste to a station that they own. So they'll often drive right past another station in order to deliver material to their own facility. Finally, the economics of scale, as you've heard, for the private transfer stations is large. It's expensive to run the stations. Capital requirements are high, and a certain throughput of waste is needed to cover the costs to effectively operate. If transfer capacity exceeds the available tons, the cost per ton increases. With all of that said, it is true that tons that flow to the private facilities rather than to Metro-owned facilities, Metro's cost per ton goes up. The transfer station operators believe that this provides an incentive for Metro to limit the amount of wet waste delivered to private stations, thus limiting private sector growth and revenue generating potential. To address this concern, Metro adopted the Tonnage Allocation Program. This program consistently and transparently allocates a percentage of the region's wet waste tons based on the annual tonnage forecast. This ensures waste flow to the private transfer stations serving the region and levels the playing field in terms of competition in the system. A total of 60% of the region's wet waste tons are available to the private transfer stations. 30% is provided as a base tonnage allocation, and if they apply for and meet certain criteria for goals-based tonnage, they receive the remaining 30%. Metro staff will be evaluating the goals-based tonnage allocation program in 2024. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So what would a cost of service study look like? There's a lot of information on this slide. What it shows is on the right-hand side, the staff suggested process for cost of service study. And on the right-hand side is a typical government rate review process. So the staff suggested process, of course, starts with Metro Council adopting the resolution to move forward with this. Then staff would utilize a public procurement process to hire a third-party consultant. Third step is that staff would convene all stakeholders. We bring in all private transfer station operators, local government representatives, and community members, and that committee would help design the study. The study design will then be shared with Metro Council, and with that, the study would kick off with a third party gathering cost data, including source financial cost documentation and conducting site visits. The third party will evaluate and aggregate the data, and then the study results will be provided to council. So the government rate review process that's on the right-hand side of the screen starts out with the garbage haulers submitting a detailed cost report. The detailed cost report is essentially the study design that I referred to with our cost of service study that we're proposing. The detailed cost report includes all of the cost of service information, including labor, transportation, disposal, overhead. Then, just like our process, the information is reviewed by a third party, site visits are conducted, and source financial documentation is reviewed. The information is aggregated and analyzed to determine the rate if a rate adjustment is needed. So there are a lot of similarities between what's already happening. Next slide, please. This is commonplace for government to do rate review and cost of service study. It's just good governance. We've heard from our local government partners that this is a common practice to ensure that collection rates are just, fair, and reasonable. DEQ recently completed a cost of service study to inform fee development for the privately owned material recovery facilities, and this is done by government regulated utilities everywhere. Next slide, please. Most jurisdictions in the region conduct some type of cost of service review. This is a list of just a few of those. Next slide, please. And also the cost of service review is included in city and county code and administrative rule. So it's actually in code for them to do this process. We understand the confidentiality of industry business data is important. We will develop with our third-party consultant confidentiality and data security procedures to protect sensitive business information. To further protect confidentiality, all proprietary data will be gathered and analyzed by the independent third party, and all cost information will be provided to Metro in aggregate. At no point in the process will Metro be in possession of proprietary data from private companies, and as a result, proprietary data will not become public record and will not be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Turn it back to you.
Next slide. Okay, so we just talked a lot about private transparency. What about public transparency? So there are a couple of things happening right now or already kicking off and on their way. There's the Waste Fee Policy Task Force that's about to kick off in the Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department. The Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department also has started regularly meeting with industry, local governments, and reuse organizations and conversations related to our budget and fees to try to continue to be more transparent about how Metro does things. And then as part of this process, we heard from a lot of you counselors that it would be really important if we're asking our private transfer stations to give us this information, that from the public side, Metro is also preparing to make more detailed and accessible information about our public transfer station and station costs available to our industry partners and just the public. Because we can't ask one person to be transparent if we aren't going to do it as well. So we understand that that is a big that is a big concern from our industry partners. And from the staff perspective, these two tracks actually work really well in concurrence with each other. You all are about to do your budget coming in the new year. And then this also has impacts on different projects that are also coming up. So we see that these things can be complementary, however council decides to go about that. Next slide. Now that we have talked to you a lot, you can talk to us. And we're happy to answer any questions, get any feedback that's on here, and any information that you think you all need as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you for some more in-depth conversation and trying to answer some of the questions that came up last time. I understand that we ran out of time last time, and so I think there's still a lot of questions on the table, but I just wanted to kick this conversation off. I don't normally start. I want to be very clear. I think what I'd like to start with is having been a city councilor and a county commissioner who has been put in the position of not having enough information and having these questions that have been raised by the mayors and councilors from across the region. I understand and I empathize, and I want to fully say it is difficult. It is difficult to know how to negotiate without enough information. So setting that aside, I also understand that this is the first time we have done this. So we can point to everybody else doing it, but I think this council needs to know how we are going to go about doing it. And I think the private side needs to know what the sideboards are. I don't think we've articulated the sideboards very well. And I think that's where the next part of this conversation needs to go. And I think we can do that in two ways. And I don't think it'll take a lot of time, but I think we need to establish those sideboards because I think there is a perception, and rightly so, we regulate and we operate. And so the trust here for me on the private side is how do we establish those sideboards? Who's part of that conversation to establish the sideboards, and how do we proceed through that? So I guess what I'd like to say is not only do we have a council that probably would like to know what those sideboards are and how they're used in other jurisdictions where there is a private-public conversation that goes on continually and they don't slide into the issue that we have, which is the operation and the regulation. We want to be clear about what we're trying to do on the regulation side versus what we're doing on the operation side. And we have two hats, and I want to make sure that those two hats are completely separate and that it's very clear to all of our partners that they're separate. So I guess as for next steps, what I need to see is how other jurisdictions have put together their rate transparency conversations with their private sector and what those sideboards are and how they've established, so that there's a better understanding on council and there's a better understanding in our partners of kind of where we're headed. And then I would love to see us actually use our newly created waste fee policy task force that we put up and stood up for our own rate transparency and bring these conversations together somehow in that committee as a policy committee to make recommendations to us on how to move forward. Now, I don't have a clear thought on how time-wise to make all of this happen, but I do think the scope of the project could be part of that conversation in the waste fee policy task force. I know we have issues about timing around RFPs. We can deal with that, but I think we need time to figure that out before it comes back to council and how to structure this and how to hear how the issues at the council level and our partners could be discussed in that kind of setting. I also understand that other jurisdictions have created a task force within the private companies to be able to work through the scope as well. I see that as still a possibility of being handled in that way. But I do think we have a waste fee policy task force that we could utilize in order to make sure the sideboards, the scope is correct before we launch into anything and be able to balance out in real time in a very public setting, how do we do that? So I think we're generally moving in the right direction. I just think we need to take a moment, because I don't think this council and I don't think our partners fully understand what it is we're about to embark in and how we're going to embark in it and how we're going to show up as Metro. I think we just need to keep moving forward in the speed of trust. So I think we're generally headed in the right direction. So I'm just going to end it there. I'm going to let my counselors ask their questions, but I think I wanted to put out a framework for us to have a conversation so that we can move forward.
President Peterson, may I just make a comment in response? One of the things that, to just pull out of Holly's presentation around the cost of service study, addresses what you explicitly just said, the building of the trust and having everybody at the table. So explicitly a part of the cost of service study includes establishing a separate committee that includes all of the private transfer stations, local governments, and community to design the study in collaboration with one another.
And what I'm proposing is both.
Yeah,
because I want these conversations to come together. I want it public. So we can talk further about how to make that happen, but that's what I'm putting out for the council. So I'm going to move around the table.
Okay.
Councilor Nolan.
Madam President, you said a lot of what I was thinking and would like to say. So thank you, and it's good to hear that we're synced up on that. I want to take the perspective that we jointly, between Metro in its provision of service, provider of service role, as well as in its regulatory role, and the private transfer station owners and operators, as well as the private haulers who are not in this immediate discussion, are collectively responsible or have a stake in achieving our goals around waste reduction and environmentally safe disposal. You've used the word trust, and I think that's one we need to focus on. I think effort needs to go in advance of launching the detailed, let's look at every single line item or however we're going to do it, to make sure that Metro is inviting, authentically inviting the private transfer station operators as partners in achieving our waste reduction goals and in achieving our equity goals and achieving our cost containment goals. I don't want to go back and rehash too much, but I think we should also acknowledge that the leaders sitting at this table here with us today inherited some baggage that they are tasked now with unpacking. And I think it's worth time. It's worth the time to invest in building that collaborative. And I understand, as a regulator, collaboration takes on a slightly different look than as a co-investor, for example. But you've talked about that in what you've presented to us in the last few weeks. And I think we need to show it and show results in it. And I'm a big believer that planning in advance like that smooths the path for actually implementing, and it's worth the time. I would encourage us to insist on the clarity, Madam President, that you talked about, but also just take the time to find out what our partners need to contribute what we need them to our adopted goals. And then my bet is, I mean, I would love to see the private transfer station operators coming here with you and saying, we agree, this is the way we can contribute the best to the regional goals. And I don't think we've invested enough time yet to have that happen.
Council President Peterson, can I note a couple of things? I appreciate both of your all comments. Councilor Nolan, I think that part of this trust we've tried to build in the run-up to this conversation, Holly personally talked with all of the private transfer stations. I talked to our local government folks, just because we can't conquer the world all by one person. In advance of this, we've tried to keep folks apprised of when these conversations are taking place publicly so that they have the time to share their feedback with council as well. I think the other part that's important to this is that proving the study design and things like that to council is a way that like this is workable for both parties. In our staff recommended process, the detailed one, not the one I said, the one that Holly said, because remember, she does technical things, not me. It would be that we start by convening that table. We would all get together and start talking about the cost of service study design and then bring it back to council before we even moved past that. So before we did any type of cost of service study, you all would get to see what that design looked like and hear from stakeholders if it was enough or not. That's part of it. We also are envisioning not just the private transfer station operators, but if they have financial people that they want to bring to the table that have done this with our local government partners more, that would be helpful. The other thing is DEQ just started a brand new process for them. They are a big behemoth of a regulator in a lot of places, but they hadn't exercised their like cost of service study and rate review muscles until they started going with the material recovery facilities. That was a very recent start. I know Holly's had conversations with DEQ about how that like process was shaped. We can provide details. I hear you loud and clear, Council President Peterson, that it would be great to have details of that. We've also asked industry how they felt about the consultant that DEQ used, things like that, to try to like bridge some of those gaps and ground truth what we're hearing. So I think those are all things we can provide as well, but there are folks who are also coming new to this, and there are ways to implement a feedback loop. I heard that in the last presentation with council along the way and lay that out very clearly so that you can keep staff in check on being co-investors to this process as we go along, or as much as we can, because we are a regulator and that's always going to have a power imbalance.
And I'm just going to add one thing. Again, I really appreciate what you're both saying about developing a collaborative process. And that is paramount to this project. That's how it's designed. That's why we would bring together that group to do the study design. And also, the project will not be successful unless there is understanding and buy-in from all parties. Whatever results we come up with, if everybody is not at the table and has an understanding of how we got to those results and has at least not everybody is going to get what they want in this, but if everybody can understand what it is and feel like they were heard, the resulting study design would be something that we would implement that would result in something that everybody could at least, I don't know, agree with, but feel okay with. This will not be successful unless we have that front end process. We can go out and do a cost of service study on our own, but the results, if we don't have this collaboration and buy-in, the results will be disputed and we won't be able to move forward the way we want to. So I very much appreciate what you both said. That is exactly our intent.
So there's a lot of defensiveness I'm hearing, and when I look for collaboration, I'm inclined to listen more to the person who we are trying to engage and their opinion about whether they have been engaged, rather than comments about what actions have been taken to engage them. You've done a lot of groundwork on this.
It's just the beginning.
It is, and I have said what I.
So let me move us on. But I think what I'm hearing is that there's a lot in what you have done and in your heads, and I'm not sure that we're clear. And so I think there's a conversation yet to have, and I know that there's a lot of information that's been shared, but I think as we go through this, trying to glean from the council what their understanding is, and maybe let's get clarity in the next couple of weeks as we looked, how do we say, what are those steps? And what clarity around the sideboards on those steps? And when we move to each step. So I think getting clarity on those things is where I'm hearing from the council. So let's just move in that in that direction. This is about getting clarity and getting more detail and establishing that up front, rather than just giving an RFP that feels kind of open-ended. I think that's where the council is going to want to have some conversation. So, Councilor Rosenthal, then Lewis, and Gonzalez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wasn't going to have any questions because I think it's fairly clear to me, but the comments on sideboards, thought that made me think that I should probably drill down a little bit. The process would seem to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, you've already established sort of you had your list on your slide of the bullets of the main elements that you think need to be. You're going to ask for an RFP from a consultant. The consultant, if it's a good consultant, will present you with some sideboards. They will present you with a specific study with some sideboards, maybe not all you want. And then that will go to your committee, which will then review those sideboards and either refine them or accept them or whatever they're going to do with those committees. And then those sideboards or that study with sideboards is going to come back to us for approval.
Correct.
Okay?
Yes, correct.
That's the process.
Correct.
And then the study proceeds. So it's a little bit of a multi-step process, but it seems like there's fairly good opportunities for establishing sideboards in this. And so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Councilor Lewis?
Sure, thank you. So I'm looking at what will the process look like? And the fifth bullet down is study design will be shared with Metro Council for any feedback. And I guess I just want to tighten that up a little bit more. I don't think that the next step is to come back to us with feedback. I think it's for approval. I think that you're hearing council want to own that this is a new thing for Metro, and it's a really important thing for Metro. So I think this is phase 1 of part 3. And phase 2 of part 3 would be actually doing the do. But the opportunity right now is for us to look at how we're going to scope and how we're actually going to see everything. What is the tool? Because I think we've used the analogy of you've seen a transfer station, you've seen one transfer station, and we're going to come up with apples and oranges. I think we're going to come up with apples and artichokes because we have so many different variables. It is not just about do you pay taxes or not, do you accept self-haul or not. It is about vertical integration. It is about size and scope of your mission. And frankly, as a region that's committed to reducing waste, we need to get away from the fact that the only end game here is going to be which slice of the pie are we getting in terms of tonnage, but about which slice of the pie are you going to get in terms of future investment around diverting from the waste stream. So I don't think anybody needs to have any foregone conclusions about what this data is going to do. This data is going to force us to say we're going to probably be doing fewer things and fewer things better instead of continuing to try and be everything to everyone when it comes to solid waste. My request from the last meeting that I think, sometimes we all say things, but this one I really care about, so I'm going to say it again really clearly. We need to disaggregate the data for the 2 public transfer stations we run. Metro South and Metro Central are 2 very different beasts. They have very different traffic patterns, and I think that if we're asking our public partners to put things on the chart full cloth, we need to do the same, particularly coming from the district where I represent the people who live around Metro South, who have a lot of concern about how old the facility is and how it's not big enough for its current use. Thank you.
Okay. Councilor Gonzalez.
Thanks, President Peterson. Yeah, I mean, I missed the last work session. I was on a flight, but I appreciate Councilor Wong for reading a statement, and I feel like feel like I might be a bit of a odd duck out of what I'm hearing. I mean, I think, I feel very, very positive and very supportive of moving forward. I think that this issue has been simmering for decades, and I've heard very clearly from constituents and jurisdictions in my district, especially that this needs to be a top priority for WPES and our solid waste system throughout the region. I mean, I feel like the communication is clear with our industry partners. I feel like through this discovery phase, there's been a lot of questions around the integrity of data, the confidentiality of data, steps that we've taken to using that as an example to highlight where I think we've really worked to set good parameters in this study. But ultimately, I think what has been shared is, and what I agree on is moving forward and moving steadily with our partners and making sure that they are part of the process. I know that when we adopted the regional waste plan, one of the things that was removed in terms of the advisory committees to WPES around rates and industry being at the table. We're in this process of reconvening a new body, a new committee that helps us get a diverse set of perspectives into what that needs to be. And I think that this study and this work is really important for how we move forward. Also, the Washington County Commission, the Board of Commissioners has been very clear about, the needs that they see as well for Washington County. And so I understand that, as a Metro Councilor, have a regional perspective, but also wanted to really bring the energy and the weight of what I'm hearing from my constituents about the urgency and the importance of this study and this report. And ultimately, the North Star of the Regional Waste Plan has been for me, in my interpretation of it, has been to share the rewards of the system and to share the burdens equally through the system. And it's clear that this is a very important step that we need to take so that we're able to understand that distribution a little bit better. And also, I don't want to finish my comments without stating how important our private industry partners are to the system, and how I feel a commitment to our hybrid system and making sure that all the things that have been shared from counselors are taken into account. But I wanted to make sure that my voice came through clearly on that. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other counselors? Counselor Lewis.
Sure, thank you so much. I guess we're at this weird point where we want to get things right. And so the difference between voting on something this week, next week, the week after feels really squishy after essentially having sat on this the entire pandemic. But I guess if we are feeling the pressure, and I've heard colleagues use the word urgency, to do this quickly, is it because there's an expectation that we are going to land this plane by next rate setting and next public budget cycle? I'm seeing a shake of the head.
Councilor Lewis, I don't think so. I think it's important to tie it to the momentum with the public transparency pieces, which are more aligned with our public processes, right? I think that this will keep going. I also think that right now with the systems facility plan, we just did the international panel, we did all that. There's some decisions around scenarios that are coming up, and kind of the next phase based on the scenarios council may or may not go with would need some of the data from this as well. And then also, as Holly mentioned earlier, the goals-based tonnage allocation will be reviewed in 2024. That has a lot of links with rates at transfer stations as well. If we're gonna break it from Metro's public rate, we'll need more data to support that. So it's also just work planning out other projects and making sure that we're leveraging certain momentum on some projects, but also setting staff up for success on other projects that are coming down the pike in this next year. So it's not gonna land the plane immediately. There'll be a lot of decisions on top of this that council will have to make as well. But this will be a data piece that's needed whether or not we do it right now or we do it in 6 months, it just might slow down other conversations.
Yeah, it's not my intent to say 6 months, but
We didn't
in
say
the
that.
next 6 weeks, right? Are we up against a deadline? And I'm hearing it's alignment with other big discussions and not anything having to do with a, June 1st or July 1st, whatever deadline.
No, that is just a statutory deadline for public governments.
Okay, Counselor Simpson and then Wong.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you, Marta, Jenna, and Holly for your presentation. It's pretty straightforward for me. I know, again, we are really catching up with everybody else around this, around getting rate transparency. But also, I think, I appreciate the engagement with not just the private haulers, but also community and our other stakeholders. I guess, for me, as I think about this is somewhat like a negotiation table. And I guess the sign of a good negotiation is nobody walks away from the table happy, but everybody got a little bit of something that they need. And so I just want to remind us that, like, as we set these tables to adjust people's expectations, that they may not get everything that they want. We may not get everything that we want, but we have to understand that we have to balance everything. And at the very end, we have to keep in mind that we serve the metropolitan region and the people within it, and we have to make sure that everything is clear, fair, and transparent for them in terms of how they pay for waste and waste and how we get rid of it, but also how we are reducing waste in the waste stream for future residents. So I just want to throw that there.
Thank you. Counselor Huang.
Great, thank you, Madam President, and thanks for the staff. I think you captured our conversation from last time really well. I think I want to throw my support behind President Peterson's recommendations. I do believe that we need to take our time and get it right, and work with our stakeholder partners to really chart the way forward. I'm also really interested in how this phase of work really sets us up for a conversation on the bigger picture of where or how to structure the regional waste management system as a whole. I know we've had many conversations with Marta and you and your team about what does it look like for small transfer stations and things like that with a new regulatory regime. So I really view it like as kind of that first conversation piece, and will help inform how we kind of build that system going forward. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to see how the process unfolds. Thank you.
Great. Seeing no other hands raised, I guess just to close this out, I was gonna look over to my right. Totally in sync. And just say, I don't think what I'm hearing from the council is a complete and utter slowdown or shutdown. It's more of a, we need to get a little bit more specificity so the council feels comfortable with the process, because I think there's a lot that has been assumed in the process that hasn't been necessarily part of the conversation with the council. And so getting the council up to speed of what those steps are and where we weigh in needs to be part of that resolution, so that it's not so that it's clear upfront where people can weigh in, how the council is approving. I just think that there's a lot that was assumed that we haven't seen in a totality. And I think that's just the small disconnect that we just got to close that loop on that to be able to feel comfortable doing this for the first time. And that we will learn from doing this anyway. There will be mistakes. There will be things that don't make sense in the end, like why did we do it that way? Let's learn from that. I get that. But right now, we've got, we don't have a full concept from from this side of the table of exactly what it takes and what assumptions we're making that we should be much more aware of and have a conversation about ahead of time before we step into it and suddenly we're like, we had no idea. So I think that's the disconnect, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning, afternoon, or afternoon, council. So a couple of things that I'm hearing that I just want to say back, and hopefully we can refine this direction, is a desire for a two-phase, kind of a step into where you would give us direction to go off and plan a study, and then we would come back and get your approval on the study itself, the assumptions, the sideboards, the parameters of that study and the timeline. And I think that we are absolutely happy to do that. I think the second thing that I want to speak to is that, what are those sideboards? Who's at the table when those sideboards are decided? How does that get done? And I think what staff is proposing, to bring some clarity to that, is that table that would include every transfer station, cities and other stakeholders, that table, we would work with them to decide the sideboards. Because I don't think, our values as a team, or your values as a council, would accept anything less than that. So I think what would be helpful to us today is if we can all be clear that table that we're proposing is where the assumptions and sideboards and parameters would be discussed. We would like your permission to bring a resolution authorizing us to create that table, to create the sideboards and the parameters. And then we would come, if you pass that, we would do that work, we would convene that table, and then we would come back to you with the results of that work from that table. Again, that includes all the private transfer stations and stakeholders. And then at that point, the council would decide, does this meet our values? Does this meet, do we understand how the study is going to work? Has it allayed folks' concerns substantially? And then we would walk through that second gate. But there would be significant, discussion. And I think, again, just leaning back on our values as an organization to, work with the people most impacted by our actions. That includes, people who run private transfer stations.
So I would just say yes, and. I really want as an outcome that all of the transfer stations are included, and the existing newly created waste, I just forget the title of it all the time, waste fee policy task force is included in the conversation as well. So I would like to figure out, how do we do both?
How they intersect.
Yes. And how do they both weigh in on the scope? So that we have a broader conversation. And to me, one is almost policy and the other is technical. And I just like to have a back and forth with Sam about how to accomplish a greater engagement than what had been envisioned, I think. And what had been, we didn't even know until just recently that this is a committee that would be established. So I think just coming to that realization is great, but I don't think it's fully an engagement that we could actually we have more that we could utilize. And I'd like to see if we can do that before so yes, and.
Okay. I think maybe what we could do is draft a resolution, some suggestions for how the committee that is stood up for this process would intersect, and I don't know if report to is the right word, but we can figure out how those two groups interact. How to engage both.
And the council, yeah.
And absolutely the council, because it's all that work is leading up to you all.
Yeah, and I guess the third part that I need more conversation about in an iterative way, very quickly, is what can we say up front? There are sideboards and there are sideboards. There's policy sideboards going into the conversation, and then there's the sideboards, the technical sideboards. And I need to know what we need to say going into the conversation, as well as what to expect coming out of the conversation on the technical side. Because right now, it seems really open-ended, and I think that's part of the problem. And so how do we state upfront our expectations as a council of this is the box we're playing in up front? And then there might be technical sideboards that everybody wants to talk about. That's great. that's exactly where that should happen. But what are we saying going into this process that we're trying to achieve?
I think that's a great question, and I think that if council is comfortable sharing now or in, discussion with staff over the, next week, few weeks, it would be important for us to hear what your values are, because I think that those first sideboards are your values. How would you like us to engage with stakeholders? What elements are important to you to include in the findings of the resolution or the whereases of the resolution, and then we can document those.
Agreed. I don't think we have time to talk about that today. And what I think would be helpful is to start from a draft. So I think if we can start a draft and bring it back to council, if that's okay, so we can get feedback on a draft.
Okay.
With all of that.
Great.
Okay. I see nodding heads. Anything last comments before we go? Councilor Rosenthal.
President Peterson, I guess I see that I see that it's important that I think we agree that the study needs to be done in some sense. I think we all agree, or maybe we all agree, that it's going to have to come back to us once they get a final thing and look at all the sideboards, technical and policy-wise. At that point, I personally would be satisfied in seeing how they did the stakeholder involvement. I don't think I need to front load. I think they've explained some of that. And so at that point, they will explain how they did the stakeholder involvement, and we'll be able to say that was sufficient or not sufficient. And for me, that is good enough. So I mean, if that's a little bit of a dissent there, I don't think I need to front load that too much.
The only thing I would say is I think it's better, the clearer we can be on expectations going into something. And if it doesn't seem like enough, we will all understand why it wasn't enough or why it was too much. But I think we should at least have the conversation of what our expectations are. So I hear you, but I think the council would like to have that conversation and at least react to a resolution with that kind of expectation baked into it. Okay? Okay, now, I just want to say at the end, you guys have done a lot to get ready for this. And clearly, it has been going on for years. So I don't think you should come away hearing again that this is not moving. It's just a reestablishment of understanding before we get going of what we can expect, because this is not, it's not something we do every day. And then we've never actually done this. It's almost like when Expos came to us and said, we always say, this isn't our first rodeo, but it was our first rodeo. And we learned a lot from it, right? And that took a lot of upfront work to actually have our first rodeo. So to me, this isn't, it's not a negative, it's just a learning process that we are going through. And I appreciate you coming back and coming back and coming back. But do understand it is a learning process for us all. This is not something that we have ever done as a council, any of us. And it just, the clearer we can be, the better outcomes we'll get on the backside. So I really do. And I know it's tough, but we'll get through it. Thanks. All right. With that, where are we? COO Communications?
It's my turn again.
Yeah.
Thank you, President Peterson. One just update I wanted to share with you all is that, as you have probably heard, the PPS teacher strike is continuing, and it is having an impact on our workforce that has children in PPS schools. I will be sending an all-staff communication today, just imploring parents who are struggling with childcare to work with their managers and supervisors. We have been communicating with our management ranks to encourage the use of all the tools at our disposal for helping parents manage these caregiving activities, from flexing schedules to hybrid or work from home if possible. Scheduling days off at the last minute, all those things that can hopefully help parents juggle what is a strike that is seeming to stretch out for quite some time and with no end yet in sight. So just wanted to make you aware of that, and if you do talk to staff who are struggling, please encourage them to speak to their managers, and if they're having trouble, they can escalate, because we are trying to be as flexible as we can in our policies. So, thank you.
Thank you. It's a rough moment for everybody. All right, Counselor Communications, any communications today?
Just something small. My
Counselor
computer died,
Gonzalez?
so.
Oh, Counselor Simpson actually had their hand up first. Go ahead, Counselor.
Thank you, President Peterson. My bad, JC.
You're good.
Yesterday, we, Counselor Lewis and I, and our junior Counselor McCall attended the opening of the Good Shepherd Village out in Happy Valley. It's the first affordable housing complex or development out in Happy Valley, backed by our Metro Housing Bond dollars. It's open 142 units to families, some reserved for veterans, some reserved for our elder community. And I just want to thank the partnership with Catholic Charities, Caritas Housing CDC, as well as Clackamas County, and John and Peggy Brokamp. Without their generous donation of 11 acres of land, that project wouldn't be possible. And John actually named that land the Good Shepherd. So it's good to see that name is carrying on in a good way for folks, and we can get people housed. So just really wanted to share that with you all today.
Great, thank you. Counselor Gonzalez and then Rosenthal.
Thanks, President Peterson. Yeah, my laptop died. I realized that this is not plugged in. I was like, what? I saw the cable here. Anyway, it's been a really fun last few days. On Friday, the city of Beaverton, the county, a whole bunch of partners, including Metro, Councilor Rosenthal gave a wonderful speech, opened the first year-round shelter in the history of Washington County, which is like really, it's amazing, but it's also like how for such a major county with so many people and such major and important employers, it's great that we're able to get over that hump and deliver this really critical service, and helping people stabilize amidst the inequality that we're facing and housing instability, all of those things. We also on Saturday cut a ribbon to Stites Nature Park in the city of Forest Grove. Metro was a major funding partner. They allocated their local share to that park, and it actually took 50 years to get that project going. 50 years yesterday, the land was donated to the city of Forest Grove. So some things take a while, but it's really nice. And that park also features the first community garden in the city, and there's multiple phases, hopefully, that will come for that park. It's 8 acres, and there's definitely an opportunity for future phases. Lastly, tonight, Metro is sponsoring the Westside Economic Alliance's 25th anniversary event. It's a cocktail reception, begins at 5:30 at the Taylor Building, which is where Northwest Natural is headquartered. So y'all are invited and are welcome to attend. I serve on the board as a representative of the Metro Council there. So they've been an excellent partner to Metro, and we value and appreciate all the engagement with business and economic development on the west side and for the Tualatin Valley.
Awesome, thank you. Councilor Rosenthal?
Thank you, President Peterson. Just an add-on, Councilor Gonzalez already reported on the shelter that was opened in Beaverton. It was not a groundbreaking, it was a wall breaking.
That's right.
And it was amazing how many people really got up there and took their swings with a big sledgehammer. Everybody got a lot of energy out of that. I just want to add, it's a great location because it's just across from a large commercial complex with grocery stores where the Fred Meyer, it's right next to Goodwill, and it's close to transportation. So it's really a very good location, 60 beds. It's going to be great. It's probably going to take a year and a half to build out, but great.
Great, and coming back to Councilor Simpson.
Real quick, I forgot to mention, the opening of the Good Shepherd was also our 1,000th unit built. So I forgot to mention the really, really good news. So that's 1,000th unit. I know we're on pace for 4,700 units. I think we promised 4,000. So that's a testament of how we are using our dollars effectively for our taxpayers. So I just really wanted to make sure we highlighted that.
No, totally. Thank you. Any further things before the council? All right. With that, seeing no further discussion, the council meeting is adjourned. We will now move to executive session, which is being held pursuant to ORS 192.660 sub 2 sub H to consult with counsel concerning the legal rights and duties of a public body with regard to current litigation or litigation likely to be filed. Our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, November 9th at 10:30 a.m. Thank you, everyone. Executive session is in 5:01. Thank you.